Welcome to Fields of Consciousness, a podcast for consciousness conversations with your host, myself, Jeffrey Stegman.
And I'm Clayton Stedman.
As consciousness explorers and founders of Focus Life Force Energy, we're here to bring a holistic approach to consciousness and to share practical examples of how you can take your life to the next level.
This is the first episode of a multi-part series, and we have a very special guest, psychologist, master researcher, and our friend, Gary Schwartz. Celebrate with us this conversation on synchronicities and what they can mean for your life.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back, or welcome for the first time to the Fields of Consciousness podcast. Today, we're excited to have our friend, Dr. Gary Schwartz, joining us. We are discussing luck, what luck and synchronicity can mean as powerful information and pointers for our life. Welcome, Gary.
Hi, such a privilege to be here with you.
Well, I'll talk about my experience of you, Gary, personally, kind of as an intro. Gary joined us on the FLFE research team through Lewis Humphreys, and the purpose is to up-level the FLFE evidence research and with more rigor, and we're developing a gold standard of research for companies like FLFE. And we spent a number of weeks creating a high consciousness field together, and deeply enjoyed the time together, and Gary's intense curiosity, openness, and beginner's mind combined with the scientific rigor and or the what do you call it? The disease of science, yeah. And your deep dives into data, there's our 3Ds, from experiments and a passion for what emerges is just a wonder to behold. It's been a privilege to be with you.
Well, thank you. It's rare to be in an environment where a disease of science, by the way, a neurologist, I once shared this with a neurologist, and he gave it an official medical diagnosis. He called it scientitis. But it's wonderful to be able to share that kind of passion for following the evidence where it takes you, and the joy of discovery, and the joy of having the privilege to learn all of the mystery and magic in the universe slowly but surely as we evolve, and to be in the presence of people and a company that's committed to that as a mindset and a heart set is very precious. So, thank you for including me on the team.
Mm-hmm. Looking forward to a deep dive into synchronicity today together.
Good.
Yeah, so I was thinking about how to introduce you, Gary. I had the thought of using a metaphor of describing you as a bowl of soup. Okay. So one of the ingredients would be highly educated. Another ingredient would be respect for the scientific process. And as you inferred before, there's a conscious awareness of scientitis. So that's something that it's a hat that I've seen you take on and put off consciously. So that's interesting. I know a few scientists, and that's always something that they have to manage. I guess the fourth ingredient amongst many would be a willingness to follow the data wherever it leads. That's Actually, that's one of our prayers we do in our research meetings, is that we ask for the God's discernment to know the truth, but to have the courage to follow the data wherever it leads. It's a nice framework to start off a meeting with. And then there's the odd hot chili pepper in the soup, and it's in the shape of a Corvette. And when you eat the soup, you hear bass music playing in the background. If soup could do such a thing, you would be that soup, Gary.
Oh. Well, I really do love soup when you think about it, and I if I remember correctly, Clayten, you like to cook, don't you? Or is that Jeff? I don't remember who the cook is.
I like to cook. I don't know if I'm really good at it, but one of the things I do when I'm really kind of feeling overwhelmed or tired is I just make a big pot of typically seafood chowder. That's my go-to.
Wow.
That's my go-to grounding cooking experience. Yeah.
Wow. Well, the reason I'm sharing is because I often use soup as a metaphor for how the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and how no one ingredient defines a complex soup. In fact, I've even spent a significant amount of time, and we probably shouldn't do this now, trying to get a deep level meaning, a definition of the word soup. So it's interesting that you bring this up. We've never had a soup conversation before. Is that correct?
We have not had soup conversation before.
Okay, and you don't typically bring up soup in these kinds of conversations. Is that correct?
I am not aware of me ever comparing anybody to a bowl of soup when introducing them.
And you probably wouldn't have guessed that I have such a deep connection, both personally in terms of loving soup and also appreciating its higher significance for looking at nature.
No, I have no historical data on you being associated with soup in any way other than a reasonable assumption that you have eaten soup.
Right. We are right now living a moment, a synchronous moment is what I'm sharing.
Yeah. I didn't even think about that in terms of why I thought I should introduce you as a metaphor, but obviously being in the presence of a super synchronicity.
A super synchronicity, S-O-U-P-E-R?
A super synchronicity person. Oh, I didn't even get that. I said I didn't even get it. It's good to be funny in ways you don't even know how you can be funny. That's like, look at that. It happens.
Right.
Yeah, it probably wasn't my thought. Well, Gary, why don't you give us a more formal introduction? I know you're a very accomplished man, and we've been, just sharing our own personal experience, but you're very highly credentialed and done some interesting things.
Yeah, well, I'll try to be brief. I've been privileged to have received a fine education, including doing my master's and PhD at Harvard in what's called psychophysiology, which is a specialty, which means the relationship between the mind and the body, and also clinical psychology, which was the health side of this. And I was then on the faculty at Harvard for 5 years, and I was recruited south to Yale University, where I was one of the youngest tenured professors at the university. I was a professor of psychology and psychiatry. I was director of what was called the Yale Psychophysiology Center and co-director of the Yale Behavioral Medicine Clinic. And that was, a great privilege and opportunity. But despite that, I also have a passion for music, and I also have a passion for Native American culture and philosophy. And I was recruited to the Southwest, to the University of Arizona, twice. And the second time I gave in and accepted it. When people ask me, why did you move to Tucson? I say it was first and foremost a move of the heart, not realizing that by making this move, I would have the freedom and the opportunity for my more energetic and spiritual side to grow. And at the University of Arizona, I'm a professor of psychology, medicine, neurology, psychiatry, and surgery. I probably got all, and I can't believe this is the first time that I've actually got them mixed up. Must be when you reach age 77, you can't even remember your credentials. That's amusing. Anyway, it's 5 departments, and please don't hold that against me. And I direct what's called the Laboratory for Advances in Consciousness and Health. I've published more than 500 scientific papers, co-edited, I think, 16 academic books, written a number of books for the lay public, including 2 that are especially relevant here. One called The Sacred Promise, how science is discovering spirit and everything, including us, and also a book called Super Synchronicity, pre-SOUPER, where science and spirit meet. And I also served for 11 years as the corporate director of development of energy healing at Canyon Ranch, which is an international wellness corporation. I used to refer to them as the Harvard of health spas. And I think that training and that opportunity, well, all of this has been in training for the opportunity of being in service to a visionary business that FLFE is manifesting. It and its helpers are manifesting, directors.
Thank you for that, Gary. Yeah, so why are we talking about synchronicity today? Well, it's almost St. Patrick's Day, so we're going to release this near St. Patrick's Day. There's the timing. Of course, the main reason is we love you, Gary, and we wanted to have you on. But St. Patrick's Day is commonly associated with luck. So there's this luck and synchronicities. We believe that what's commonly noticed as luck, could be synchronicities, and we'll get into what that synchronicities mean. But I was looking up the math around a 4-leaf clover, and it looked like horticulturalists were saying about 1 in 10,000, Gary, for a 4-leaf clover. Actually, 1 in a million for a 5-leaf clover.
Wow.
So, finding 2 4-leaves then would be, am I doing the math right? It's 1 in 1,000 times 1 in 1,000, so it would be 1 in 100 million. Is that the right math there?
Well, if it's 1,000 is 1,000, it would be 1 in a million. And my math is not good without a calculator.
Yeah, it's 1 in 10,000. Yeah.
Okay, then it's right. Then it's 1 in a million. 100 million. Well, anyway, somebody can figure it out.
Yeah, 100 million. Yeah. So, and of course, there's some heredity of 4-leaf, and so there might be clumps of them, and that I was reading, but it's just one of those examples. People think how rare that is, right? 1 in 10,000 to find 1 4-leaf clover, and what we'll be getting into is the math of these synchronicities, especially these super synchronicities, like just how astounding the odds are, which, is something that just really struck me about your book and really helped me to understand and why pay attention to these synchronicities.
Well, it's really interesting that you forewarned me that you were going to be honoring St. Patrick's Day and the question of luck. And I figured I better learn something about St. Patrick's Day and its relationship to luck. Because the only thing I knew about St. Patrick's Day was when I was a kid, I used to watch the St. Patrick's Day parade, and I knew that people wore green, but I really didn't know anything about it. So I did a little bit of reading and learned that there really was a St. Patrick, and that he really was a very special person, and he deserved his, as far as we can tell, the special honor that he was given and designation and recognition in the church. And I also read about the 4-leaf clover and luck and was thinking about that. And there are at least 2 synchronicities attached to you deciding to pick that. Now, unfortunately, some people say that I'm a magnet for synchronicity or an attractor in the case of fractal geometry for synchronicities, but I certainly nurture them, particularly among people who themselves are deeply intuitive and are prone to synchronicity. So I'll just mention 2 points, and we can think about them or how, if relevant to the latest conversation. But one is that this is the first time I've ever been asked to do anything in the context of St. Patrick's Day, or for that matter, any saint. But you asked me to do this at this particular moment. And why that's curious is because I've had a deep interest in the, quote, saint hypothesis, i.e., the idea that there really were people who lived on the earth and then, quote, they physically died, but their consciousness and energy and personality continued, survival of consciousness after physical death, and that therefore the saint hypothesis takes on scientific plausibility. And the idea that one could literally verify that particular saints who were interested in verifying their existence, if they chose to, could participate in 21st century research, documenting their continued presence and caring about human life. And that fits into the broad context of the book I mentioned, called The Sacred Promise. And literally, I think it was around the same week that you first sent me this invitation, I had my first secret reading with an evidence-based medium where a alleged saint was invited to participate in the research, and we received evidential information. And one of the anomalies that came through in that information was the color yellow, which I didn't connect to our later yellow synchronicities, which we will maybe talk about as an example of a living, literally, synchronicities happening right now. But the second thing I'd just like to share, so there's that set of saint hypothesis, but then there's the question of the four-leaf clover and the four leaves, and and the geometry and the mathematics of that. Now, I had never thought about what's the probability of getting four leaves and that kind of thing. It's a very reasonable thing to ask. Could that have happened simply by chance? And by the way, you're right. There's a 1 in 10,000. There's a probability that it could have happened by chance. But what's odd is that I was wondering whether there was some event, because I was thinking about this upcoming special podcast that you were inviting me to participate in. And I was just wondering whether there was some example that I could use that might relate to a four-leaf clover. And yesterday, due to a very odd circumstance, which we can talk a little bit more later, I happened to be in a context where I was looking in my rearview mirror. I was driving to a dealership about to fix some mistake that they made, and in the rear of my window, I saw a yellow Corvette with a black stripe. Now, there's a 1 in 100 probability of seeing a yellow car, because that's the frequency that cars are purchased in that color. And there's lots of statistics about that. So there's at least 1 in 100 chance you're going to see a yellow car in your rear window. But what struck me as odd was that when I looked to the side, to the right of me was another yellow golden car. So now there were 2 cars, one to the right and one behind me. And then directly to the front of that car, because we were at a stoplight, there were these yellow bubbled places, which it turns out are for blind people, so they know when they're stepping out into the street. Sometimes they're red, sometimes other colors, sometimes they're yellow. There's maybe 1 in 10 probability that if you're at a cross street, it might be yellow, or maybe 120. I mean, 1 in 20%, that is 1 in 5. But the probability of being at a cross street that have these yellow, a lot of them don't. So anyway, it's maybe at least 1 in 100. So there's the yellow bubbled walk next to the yellow car, and behind me is the yellow car. I said, "Gee, that's 3." So I said, "Where's the 4th?" And then I looked to my left. You can't make this stuff up. I took pictures of it. And on my left was a yellow golden SUV. I was surrounded. Right?
Whoa.
It was almost like a perfect, four-leaf clover. So I said, "Okay, universe, thank you." And it's a perfect example of a highly improbable set of events occurring at a given moment And then, of course, the challenge is, how could it happen? And if so, what's its intention and what are its potential meanings?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, Gary, because in our meetings, we were meeting once a week for probably 6 months, and then we're meeting once a month now with a certain group, and you meet with other groups in the company, and you're always noticing synchronicities in the meetings and connecting the dots for those. That's so. I think we gave you the name Synchronicity Guru, if I'm not mistaken. That was your.
I think you did, and it's
Yes.
probably the highest honor I've ever received, because I've never wanted to be a guru in anything. There's often a negative connotation to the word guru, but there's also, of course, a deeper, more spiritual meaning. And I guess if I was going to be a guru or anything, it would be an observer and celebrator of genuine connections.
Yeah, it was more done in play, but I think sometimes these things are said, and it's like, and when you're in a really good space, I think the divine speaks through somebody in the group. It's almost like it's playing with us. It's another, I don't know if you call it a synchronicity, but yeah, when you say like the soup thing, I mean, I told Jeff I was going to talk about soup, but I didn't tell you, and I don't know why I compared you to a bowl of soup, but that's just kind of the thought I had. So I asked God, okay, how do I introduce Gary? And that was the thought I got. So I'll assume it's from a higher power. And your book, I don't know that there's a lot of books written on synchronicities, how to notice them, and that have an evidence-based spirituality and divinity correlation to that body of work. So it seems to be pivotal in the field. Is that correct, Gary, in your experience?
I think that if you add that combination, we say the soup, the mixture of ingredients that define that book. Now, some people say the book is all wet. Okay, then that's a bit of now humor again.
Yes.
Okay, but humor aside, I think it is the only book that I know of that combines a wealth of well-documented evidence that also deals with the higher mechanisms and meanings that are required in order to, with integrity, make sense of the complexity of the data as the data are being revealed, and tries to do that in a way that is both personal and academic, if you would. I think if you put all that together, I think you're right. It's a unique book.
It's a unique book. And what's interesting is, back to a personal experience, is you just gather evidence as you go throughout your life, like with the 4 vehicles around you that were all yellow. I know there's times when something comes up in one of our meetings and you will document that, write it down, ask us to send information about it. And that's just the way you live. And it's an ongoing, it's like life is your laboratory. That's my experience of you.
That's interesting that life is my laboratory, because in the book, The Sacred Promise, I used the term that I called self-science, which is where we apply the scientific method to the laboratories of our personal lives. And the beauty of using aspects that we learn from science, and science comes from the French skier, which simply means to know. It's just ways of better knowing and making sense of the things around us, is that synchronicity research is really cheap. Like, you don't even have to buy anything, because normally, especially now that almost everyone has a smartphone, which has got audio and it's got texting, and you can talk to Siri and immediately have it record things, and you can take photographs. And so it's very easy to document events when they occur. Second, you don't have to get human subjects committee. There are no federal government issues involved. And as long as, of course, you're respecting, personal privacy and so on, it's the kind of, quote, science that any of us could do. And it's really fun, because the universe, as far as I can tell, once you entertain the idea that there is some sort of universal consciousness, infinite intelligence, what Native Americans call Great Spirit, we Judeo-Christians call God, divinity, whatever word once you recognize this level of consciousness as a foundation for everything, and that everything is a part of it, it's not surprising that its sense of humor is going to be at least as great as ours. And that if we enjoy playfulness and animals enjoy playfulness, you can be darn sure that it's highly probable that the divine is even more playful than we are. And it likes to play with us. So it's a very viable hypothesis to I think to enjoy the process. And I think that's, by the way, one of the characteristics of people like me who have so many synchronicities is it's not only because we're open to looking and we pay attention to patterns and then ponder whether they have meaning or not, and be cautious about jumping to conclusions about them, but because we so enjoy them and relish them, that there's so much a gift of life that I think that Rhonda calls it, my beloved, she calls it the continuity of encouragement from divinity.
So yes, Rhonda has some good Rhonda-isms, as we've been calling them. My favorite, well, the one that I have to think about that one, because the other one that she said was, there is only one life and it is infinite. And part of what happens for those of us who don't know much about Jeff and I, and you do a lot of kinesiology and muscle testing, and we were trying to create a definition of synchronicities that would test as a very high truth. And one of the definitions we came up with was that synchronicities are a language of the divine. And there may be many ways to express a high truth definition about synchronicities. And a lot of our subscribers have emailed us and asked us, some have asked us for definitions of things. And it's very interesting to explore language and its relationship to measuring truth. And synchronicities are one of those things that I use to look for confirmation of my life being in alignment with divinity, or confirmation that, or on the positive or negative, that a decision I'm considering is in the highest and best interest of all. So that's
wow.
There's lots of ways to use synchronicities. I use synchronicities a lot more before I get into muscle testing. I tend to do muscle testing or kinesiology to just sort of get verification of my direction. But, there was a time when I would look for synchronicities, and of course we called them signs back then. We didn't, call them synchronicities. Sure. But yeah, it is a type of guiding light, I think, for people who use them consistently and have a relationship with synchronicities that supports them, because there must be a challenge in, and trying to make meaning out of things that aren't there, and then recognizing at the same time the odds of this happening are 1 in a billion or 1 in a trillion. It's just really extraordinarily odd to have 4 yellow cars around you when you've noticed yellow the day before. I mean, the statistic, and have a yellow crosswalk. I mean, the odds of that, I don't know how you'd even calculate it, but it would be extraordinarily odd.
Yes. And so my problem with listening to the two of you is that you're always triggering thoughts. And again, remembering I have this disease called scientitis that you nurture. You immediately say things that then push on that button that lead me to say, we someday have to do research that bridges the arena of synchronicity and muscle testing in relationship to higher consciousness and flow in life and so on. Because it's work that's, quote, begging to be done. And calling it a guiding light is part of the deeper meanings that I've been coming to about why have I been constantly reminded over and over of late through various sources that the light, the yellow golden light should be guiding us toward a number of things. and conclusions.
Much like the yellow golden logo of FLFE.
Yes.
Yeah, it's the languages of the divine. So if synchronicity is a language of the divine, and then perhaps muscle testing is another language of the divine, maybe channeling is another language of the divine. So a research that looks at the correspondence between those things, I think is what you're saying, Gary, right?
Yes, I think that, yes, beautiful. And if it were to be a four-leaf clover to complete the last leaf, it would then be the evolution of technology that higher consciousness beings and ultimately the source itself could use to communicate with us above and beyond those other three. And one's not a substitute for the other, but the like the work that we're doing with the quote soul phone for communication technology.
Connecting across the veil.
Yeah. So these are interesting times.
They are interesting, expansive. I don't know if you know, Gary, I noticed yesterday after we scheduled this that today is March 8th, or 3/8, or 8 plus 3 is 11. So I don't know, it's an 11 synchronicity today. And I've just, after reading your book, there are so many 11 synchronicities kind of started out your journey.
Yes.
Of noticing synchronicities. And here we are on an 11 today.
And you have been adamantly saying that one of the things you wanted to do in this podcast or the next one is to talk about the 11 lessons that I learned from the 11 super synchronicities that I described in the book. I know I didn't make the 3/8 connection, but thank you. That's good.
Well, let's dive in. So what is a synchronicity? How do you define it, and a super synchronicity? And it'd be great to know the various types that you identified too.
Well, synchronicities are, quote, coincidences or co-occurrences of two or more events in a close proximity in time, sometimes simultaneous, but often more typically sequentially, where the probability of their occurring by chance is small, and where not only do they typically occur at meaningful times in our lives, but often we don't know the meaning at the time that they occur. So often they're mysterious, and they require that we be detectives and that we seek out what the meaning or significance is. Synchronicities first became recognized, I think, by Carl Jung, the distinguished psychoanalyst, in his book Synchronicity. And there have been a number of people who have written about synchronicity since. Some people have bridged science and synchronicity like Jung did, and some of this work was I talk about this in the Sacred Promise book. The more recent work by a psychiatrist whose name is Bernard Beitman, he wrote a book called, I think it was called Connecting with Coincidence. And he uses the term coincidence as opposed to synchronicity because he's trying to be quote more conservative, because some people think that coincidence is equivalent to chance, and therefore it has no meaning. So it becomes dismissed as a coincidence, not recognizing that that's actually an interpretation which may or may not be valid. But then he used the word synchronicity in the subtitle. But he calls it coincidence science, the evolving science, coincidence. I prefer the term synchronicity partly because it honors Jung and because it deals with synchronization which is a broader term. Now, in my life and in my book, I talk about three types of synchronicity, what I call type 1, type 2, and type 3. And type 1 is the most frequent one that we have. It's the one that most people are aware of, and that's simply a pair of events. So in order to have a synchronicity, you have to have two things happen. And typically when the first one happens, you don't know it's a synchronicity until the second one happens. And then it confirms the first one that happens. And when that pair occurs, you go, wow. You say, gee, that's interesting. That's a type 1. Now, a type 2 synchronicity is when that pair of events continues in terms of content and meaning. And I call type 2 synchronicities when you have 3, 4, or 5 in a row. So they're serial coincidences, to use for my people's language. And that's a type 2. But then you can have 6 or more synchronicities serially. And I call that a type 3 synchronicity. And a type 3 synchronicity starts becoming extremely improbable. That's when you start really seeing these very high probabilities of improbability occur. And I call those type 3 synchronicities super synchronicities, in the spirit of the way science uses the word super, like superconductivity, or supercomputers, or super colliders, or super clusters of galaxies. I wasn't using it in the more lay language like supermarkets or Superman. I have no objection to those, either those places or the fictional character. But I meant the word super in a serious way, like superconductivity or super collider. And my journey to synchronicity began because I had an experience where there were too many 11s in my life, numbers that that were 11 or added up to 11. And because I'm statistically oriented, it was as if, and this is my pre-spiritual days, it was as if the universe is saying, the only way we're going to get your attention is to make something that's highly improbable that fits within that diseased brain you have, that science brain. And so and so I began to notice this, and I realized it was, as Susie Smith puts it, it was my adopted grandmother, and published 30 books in the field of parapsychology and life after death. One of her wonderful phrases was, some things are too coincidental to be accidental. And I realized that this pattern of numbers and that were actively involved with my life was just hard to dismiss. And it was that statistical anomaly that started me then on the journey to trying to seek an understanding and an explanation. And that's when I began having more and more anomalous events occur in my life that ultimately, years later, I mean, it started in the early 1980s. Now, I'm really going public with this work. Most of it's been done outside the university, as you said, in the laboratory of my life.
So, Gary, have you done any work on the statistical correlation between events happening and have any hard data on odds? I mean, I know you've talked about it with us, in our other meetings.
Let me tell you what I have done. What I have done is developed I would say, a semi-formal procedure for estimating the probability of anything occurring by chance. And then the process by which you calculate not just the probability of it occurring by chance, but translating it into real time. In other words, how much time would it take to actually experience this if you were in real life looking for it. Because one of the fundamental questions that people ask is, well, if you look for yellow VWs, you're going to find them. First of all, there are VWs out there, and secondly, there are yellow VWs. And if you look for yellow cars more generally, you're going to find yellow cars. Of course, there's 1 in 100. So how do you know that you're not just looking for yellow and you're just by chance noticing yellow? And the answer is that it's not looking or being open and detecting is a prerequisite for tracking a synchronicity, but it's not the explanation for their existence. In order for it to be a real synchronicity, it has to be above and beyond looking.
Yes.
So that's where I then will do things, and usually this requires that I have a table of numbers in front of me, which I don't have because we're doing this informally. But like in the most recent set of synchronicities that I had with these combination of yellow events, I calculated how much time would it take to, for example, see a yellow car driving along at a normal rate. Okay, so if there's 1 in 100 cars and it takes you a couple of seconds to see a given car, you've got to drive at least 5 minutes to see a car. So how much time would it take to see 2 yellow cars and have them be together? Not because by definition, the first 5 minutes you'll see 1 yellow car on the average. The second 5 minutes you'll see another yellow car. But what's the chance of seeing them together? Well, it's 100 to 1 times 100 to 1, which comes out to be 1 in 10,000. But what does that translate into time? It would take you 5 minutes to find 1, but you'd have to repeat that 100 times in order to get to see 2 of them within the same period. So now all of a sudden you've got 500 minutes. Well, what about seeing 3 of them at the same time in their period of time? Well, all of a sudden you're talking about weeks, and then you're talking about months. And by the time you've gotten to 6 or more events, now you're talking years. Which means if you were doing this, if this was your full-time job, 8 hours a day, you're looking for yellow cars and you're trying to find, let's say, 6 of them or 8 of them all together simultaneously by chance alone, you're going to have spent years. And so therefore, the explanation that, well, if you look for it, you're going to find it. My response to people who ask that question, and it's a good question to ask, is do the experiment. I can give you the calculation here, but the only way you'll be convinced for sure is if you do the experiment. And when I teach synchronicity to students, because as part of when I was teaching a course on the psychology of religion and spirituality at the University of Arizona, I included the topic of synchronicity. And one of the things I would give students is the task of looking for a particular event for a week and noting every time that occurred, and then seeing what the probability of a given event occurring would be by chance compared to what it would. And what you find, of course, is that none of the students have the combination of events of the super synchronicities that I'm talking about.
So would you consider the 4 yellow cars and the yellow crosswalk a super synchronicity in terms of your experience?
Well, by definition, it would be a type 2 synchronicity because there were only 4. Okay, so it has to be a super synchronicity, it's got to be 6 or more. However, do you want to hear something really odd?
That's a baited question, but yes, I'll take the bait.
Question. I was hoping you'd say no. No, I was hoping you wouldn't say no. That's what I meant. Okay, so listen to this. Rhonda and I had to go off on an errand early this morning, and we were driving back in the car, and I I was, I had to get back in time for this podcast, and Rhonda knew that, and I said, honey, I've been thinking about this podcast, and I think I found a way while we were driving earlier of how I could explain this. I mean, statistically how to do this with an experiment with students using, for example, yellow and black marbles. Imagine you have, a jar of 100 marbles. 99 of them are black, and one of them is yellow. And now you randomly come in and reach in and pick you shake them, and then you randomly pull out a marble. What's the probability? How many times is it going to be yellow? Okay. And I said, I was triggered by that thought while yesterday when I was going for the car. And as I was telling her that story, directly in front of her, she was driving and I was talking, there was a yellow car. Now, by chance, of course, there's going to be a yellow car. There's 1 in 100 chance to be a yellow car. So there was a yellow car. I said, gee, it's amusing that I'm telling you this event so you can have this experience. And then as I'm noting that it's odd that there's a yellow car, at the moment that I'm telling you the story about how we can use yesterday's event with 3 yellow cars plus a sidewalk to do this, a yellow VW Bug is driving in the opposite direction. So now I got 1 yellow car in front of me, and I got a second one here simultaneously while I'm telling her the story about the yellow cars. So immediately I go into my conditional probability. I was saying, wow, I said, that's really quite interesting. But, of course, what would make it really statistically significant is there were at least 3. 3's the charm. That's the lucky charm. And would you believe, literally a car or 2 later, once again coming down the road, but now a 3rd yellow car. Now, since this journey has started, I've not seen 3 yellow cars in a close proximity. I mean, except during the early period when I was into and discovering the synchronicity. So now I'm surrounded by yellow cars yesterday. I then today decide that I'm going to use this as an example. And while I'm telling the story, 3 yellow cars occurred. That's now a super synchronicity, right?
And I noticed you said yellow marble and, 1 yellow marble and 99 black ones.
Now, why is that important?
Well, it's yellow again.
Yes, I was doing that to be as a perfect, but there it was intentional. There I was saying, okay. Yes, yeah. There it was, because I wanted students to imagine the task of how frequent is it. I mean, you could have another way to do it, of course, is you could have a bag of marbles where all the different colors of cars in their proportion, and one of them is yellow. And then you have to pull out and say, well, this is a red one, this is a blue one, this is a green one, and so on. Anyway, so yeah, that just in the 2 days, that became a type 3 synchronicity.
Wow.
Thank you for joining this episode of Fields of Consciousness, the podcast of consciousness conversations. We invite you to visit the link below the episode to experience a completely free trial of focused life force energy for 15 days.
If you like, you can subscribe to the Fields of Consciousness podcast and tune in next time. We release new episodes every other week on Tuesdays at 11:11 a.m. PST. Onward and upward.